The whole story of Bardstown, Kentucky, I'm intimidated by this to a certain extent because I met a lady earlier who's from there. And she says she went on the tour and she knows it all. And I said to her, why don't you give the talk? Because I don't know it all. Okay. But the interesting thing is that all of this is very deep within the story of God's people and church. And so we have to look back a little bit before we arrive on the shores of America and sail down the Ohio on the flatbeds from Pittsburgh, which brought the Catholics and the church into the frontier. One of the very interesting things about this is that we have the sense, through our own experience of the great Catholic immigrations into the major cities of the United States, we always have a sense of ourselves as newcomers. We always kind of have a sense of a connection to ourselves as somehow or other not participants in the great experience of Catholicism, the great experience of the American Republic, because we have this mindset we are an immigrant church. Well, that might be true in New York City and in Boston, but there was one place in the United States where that was not true, and that was west of the Alleghenies, along the Ohio River, buried deep in Kentucky, very close to where the modern Abbey of Gethsemane stands, as the heart of Nelson County, Kentucky, which was larger in the old days and included all sorts of places, but this was part of the place where Catholicism participated in the frontier experience of the United States. We cut off, of course, the West and the South, all of the Spanish, because that was so much earlier. But as far as the northeastern quadrant of the modern United States, this is a drama and a story which is fascinating and phenomenal. At the Council of Trent in the 16th century, they came to confront one of the great difficulties of the age. During the Protestant Reformation in Germany, something like 75% of the priests left. And part of it was understood to be, even as far as with the people themselves, is there was kind of a lack of some kind of inner consciousness and inner awareness of what it was they were supposed to be and what was the context, the intellectual and reasonable context of the faith and the inner formation and conformity with the faith. And so under the guidance of St. Charles Borromeo, they set up a seminary system to train and to form priests for the church after the traumas of the 16th century. There was one place in Europe which refused to conform to that, and that was France. And in France, instead, St. John Eudes and St. Vincent de Paul set up a system of both apprenticeship and training in order to have well-formed priests for service in the church of the 17th century France. There was, at the end of their apprenticeship, a 10-week retreat and seminar in which they were to be instructed and tested on all of the important doctrines of the faith and be able to express and to experience a spiritual coalescing of their experiences as apprentices. This was gradually to become obsolete, and it is under Msgr Ollier, the founder of a society of priests exclusively for the formation of seminarians, and it was centered at the parish of Saint-Sulpice in Paris, and eventually, contrary to Msgr Ollier's desires, became known as the Sulpicians. They then were the ones who began formal seminary training in France. In 1789, the French Revolution broke out, The rage and the wrath against the crowds, against the institutional church, caused a tremendous upheaval in the French clergy. We know that the civil government demanded that each priest swear an oath of allegiance to the revolutionary government over and above any allegiance to Rome. Many of those priests did so. Many more refused to do so and became underground during the French Revolution and afterward. Others fled the country and found some place to exercise their ministry as priests. And one of those places, through the good efforts of Father Emery, the Superior General of the Sulpicians, and in conversation with John Carroll of Maryland, decided that some of those Sulpician priests should come to the United States. And that in the midst of the American Revolution, at the founding of our Constitution, therefore, some priests of the Sulpician, of the Society of Saint-Sulpice, arrived in the United States. They had been preceded by the Society of Jesus, which had come over in the 17th century. If you've heard the story of Father Andrew White and the ship, the Ark and the Dove and so forth, when Maryland was a Catholic colony founded by Lord Calvert, and by George Calvert, Lord Baltimore. And as they then began to sink their roots, they encountered a problem as well. But first of all, what I'd like to do is just very briefly look at the man, John Carroll, the first bishop in the United States, because he is the one who founds the missions in Bardstown, Kentucky. Carroll was born in 1735, and in 1753 he joined the Society of Jesus. He was a Jesuit, therefore, for 20 years. In 1773, Pope Clement XIV suppressed the Society of Jesus. And in so doing, all Jesuits had to find another venue to exercise their priesthood. Just as a little anecdote of that, Clement XIV, his last name was Ganganelli, he was a Franciscan. And it was through the pressure of the French monarchy, essentially, that the Jesuits were suppressed. And I had classmates who were in Rome, who, when I was north of the Alps, and after all of their exams at the Gregorian University, which was a Jesuit university, they used to faithfully go to the tomb of Clement XIV and lay roses before him and pray that he might be resurrected for a moment or two. John Carroll, however, as he returned to Maryland in 1774 from England, he returned to Maryland and he made an interesting observation. He said, there are some Catholics in Maryland, but they contribute nothing to the support of religion and its ministers. The whole maintenance fell on the priests themselves. The produce of their land was all that was sufficient to answer their demands. And so what happened was, from the very beginning, and this is a theme in American Catholic history, the theme of the struggle over property. It begins right away, and it stays, if you have followed some of the more recent events in St. Louis, it still actually was an issue not many years ago. In fact, is less than 5. Carroll then lived with his mother, and when in fact he asked the procurators of the former property of the Society of Jesus if they could use the former Jesuit property to help to support the clergy, the Jesuits said no. And they said no because Carroll had refused to leave his mother's estate and to take another assignment from London that they had made to him. And so they got even and said, fine, that's all right, but now you're on your own. And that probably was a very valuable thing, because as the church moved into Kentucky, these same kind of struggles continued. Lawsuits between priests and bishops and so forth over the ownership of private property. It became a characteristic, and eventually was to lead itself into this whole question of trusteeism in the United States. After the war, after the American Revolutionary War, the question was, how could they hang on to their property and still carry on their missionary work when in fact the Constitution of the United States did not grant them equal opportunity and rights. Only in Maryland, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Delaware were Catholics liberated by the American Constitution. They were denied privileges in accordance with English law, English penal laws, in many of the other colonial states. And that also made the frontier appealing, because those same restrictions that were part of the English Penal Code did not extend into the frontier over the Alleghenies. In 1784, then, the priests who did exist, and there were not many of them, they said that they gathered together, and here was Carroll's assessment of all of this. And he says, there are only 19 priests in Maryland, and there are only 5 priests in Pennsylvania, and 2 of those priests are over 70 years old, and that most of them were former members of the Suppressed Society of Jesus, and that's what we have to work with. And he said, in Maryland itself, there are only 15,000 Catholics, 3,000 of them black slaves. In Pennsylvania, there are 7,000 Catholics, in New York, 1,500, and in Virginia, 2. They then said, the priests, therefore, drew up a resolution to send to Rome. They said, given the state of affairs, a bishop here is unnecessary. And so they asked only for a superior of the mission. If one is sent, if a bishop was sent, he is not to be entitled to a living from any of the priest's lands. In other words, he has to support himself. He has to be a farmer. 3, a committee of 3 will make the report to Rome. And so they did, and Father Carroll was appointed superior by Rome. In fact, as this then developed, within a few years, they needed, of course, a bishop because the Sulpicians began to arrive. Among those Sulpicians was Father Benedict Joseph Flagey, Father John David, and eventually Father Charles Nerinx, and some of the others. And those of you who are from the area around Bardstown, those who are familiar with the story of now the present Archdiocese of Louisville, you know that John David is a very important name, and you know that Charles Nerinx is a very important name. Also, the territory of Kentucky began to be opened up during this time. In 1768, there was a meeting between the 6 nations, Mohawk nations, with some white settlers. And they agreed at Fort Stanwix, New York, to allow white settlers into the Kentucky territory for $10,000 or 10,000 pounds sterling. Now, the people from Kentucky can be very proud, because Kentucky went for 10,000 pounds sterling and Manhattan for $24 of trinkets. It kind of places things in perspective, I would guess. There was something called the Catholic Family League from St. Mary's, St. George County, Maryland. And they were the first ones to begin the long trek west. They went, first of all, to Pittsburgh, which previously had been known as Fort Duquesne. Then they waited for the river to rise so that they could take the flatboats down the Ohio to Limestone, Kentucky, which is present-day Maysville, Kentucky. From there, they went overland down to Lexington, and from Lexington down to their first settlement called Pottinger Creek, which was then in Nelson County. Following this, the first ones arrived in 1775. In 1785, 10 years later, the first Catholic church was built at Holy Cross, Kentucky. And this migration, and there was a story, it's a great story, that in this settlement of Pottinger Creek, once they had come from the rich lands of Maryland into the hills of Kentucky, that on Saturday nights in celebration in the center of the settlement, they used to have a little ritual that they did, where each man would bend over, lift up his coattails, and the other one would boot him in the behind. And when some stranger asked, "What is this all about?" they said, "This is to remind us of how stupid we were to leave Maryland, but now it's too late to go back." It's something like the Israelites in the desert. Why did you take us out of Egypt? Why did you do that? What happened then was one of the seminarians from Saint-Sulpice in Paris who came over was a man by the name of Stephen Baden. We call him Baden. I'm sure his name was Badin, but we call him Baden. He was born in Orléans, France in 1768, and he died in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1853. His story is fascinating. He was the first priest ordained in the United States. He came over as a subdeacon. When Saint-Sulpice was closed by the Revolution, he decided to come to America. He arrived with Benedict Flagey and John David, but he himself was not yet ordained. He was ordained by Bishop Carroll, and it was Carroll's first ordination in the U.S. In September of 1793, he was sent to Kentucky, the only priest. There had been a priest who had preceded him into Kentucky, a Franciscan priest, and he had stayed only a little while. But because they had promised to provide him with a living if he came to serve them, and then refused to do so once he got there, and he found that farming and meeting the demands of the mission were more than he could personally handle, he left and went back to Virginia. Father Baden, however, who came in 1793, and for almost 14 years was alone in Kentucky, whose territory included Kentucky, Tennessee, Southern Ohio, Indiana, Vincennes, which was the primary settlement in Indiana at the time, and also over into Illinois. By himself, he lived those 14 years almost entirely in the saddle. He was constantly traveling. He had a small cabin back at Holy Cross in Kentucky, but most of the time he was spent traveling. He was, as a matter of fact, probably a man of incredible dedication and courage. In that 14 years, however, he was able to interact with the local people who eventually gave him land in support of his mission and so forth, but it was a long struggle. There was another characteristic of these French priests that came over. How many of you have ever read anything about the Curé of Ars? How many of you ever read any of his sermons or anything like that? One of the things that he loathed and that he preached against all the time was dancing. That was the worst of all possible things. This was the great battle between Father Baden and the Catholics of Kentucky, was dancing. They would get together on Saturday night and have a dance, a Kentucky dance, you know, the American kind of dancing, the reels and all of those kinds of things. And every Sunday, whenever he was anywhere, he would begin by denouncing all of their dancing the night before. was part of the French ethos of the 18th century. If you remember, the curé of Ars was just constantly vexed about people dancing, and he was able to suppress it in Ars. And, but at any rate, that was one of the great struggles that he had. Baden, Father Baden, settling at Holy Cross and at White Sulphur in Scott County, Kentucky, about 16 miles from Lexington, traveled probably over 100,000 miles in his 14 years as the only priest west of the Alleghenies. So when we kind of are troubled by our priest shortage, I think that we might be able to say we're really not all that bad off. We're not in good shape, but there's more than one anyway. In 1805, Father Baden had been alone now for 12 years when Father Charles Narings, another one of the Sulpicians, arrived in Kentucky. And Father Narings was to become a very, very important character on the frontier as well. In fact, we'll talk about it in a moment, what was some of the first things that they did when they came into the frontier. But first of all, in 1808, and here, for those of you who are local from Columbus, it was in 1808 also that some of these Maryland settlers trickled through on their way to Pittsburgh, trickled through Somerset, Pennsylvania, and eventually into Perry County, Ohio, and founded the community of Somerset, Ohio, in Perry County, where we have just celebrated the 200th anniversary of the first Catholic Mass in Ohio. That it was the Ditto, the Fink families that had come here and had immediately petitioned Bishop Carroll, by then Archbishop Carroll, for a priest for Ohio. They didn't get one for 10 years, but some of these missionary priests who wandered through did say Mass. And if any of you are here and local and have never done so, it'd be interesting for you to drive down to Somerset, go to St. Joseph's Church, and see the small museum that's there. It is, as a matter of fact, one of the great frontier moments in American Catholicism. In 1808, the Bishop Carroll decides that there must be someone able to offer confirmation and leadership among the Catholics west of the Alleghenies. And so what he does is he sends and appoints as a bishop Father Benedict Flaget, who at that time was a professor in the seminary, Sulpician Seminary in Baltimore. He had spent 3 years on the frontier. He had been sent to Vincennes, Indiana, actually, and had spent 3 years there during the smallpox epidemics. He had not only looked after the people at Vincennes that were the white settlers, but he became very engaged also with the Indians. What happened was the French superior of the Sulpicians said, our purpose, we don't mind allowing our men to be missionaries, but our purpose is to train priests. And so, against the wishes of Bishop Carroll, the French superior of the Sulpicians called Flaget back to Baltimore to teach in the seminary. Carroll sought someone who he thought could handle the frontier. And so he appealed to Rome to name Father Flaget as the bishop of a new diocese in Kentucky, the center of the Catholic settlements there around Nelson County, the town of Bardstown. When Flaget found out that this had happened, it was fortuitous, he thought, for him that Pope Pius VII was at that time a prisoner of Napoleon and unable to promulgate the decree that appointed him bishop. So Flaget fled the United States. He returned to France And he stayed there for 2 years, trying to find someone to agree with him as to why this shouldn't happen. Eventually, the superior of the Society of Saint-Sulpice ordered him to accept the episcopacy. And so Flagey then reluctantly had to sail back to the United States. And begrudgingly, he accepted his consecration as bishop by the hands of John Carroll. He then began his journey to Bardstown, which was to travel by foot from Baltimore to Pittsburgh, to wait in Pittsburgh for the Ohio River to rise with the spring rains so that he could board the flatboats with his friend, Father John David, and began the long journey to Maysville. From Maysville, he was met and was able to travel by horseback from Maysville to Lexington and from Lexington to Bardstown. He arrived in Bardstown, having been appointed in 1808, he arrived in Bardstown in 1811. Here, he now was no longer, Father Baden was no longer alone, but this created its own kinds of problems, because after so many years, he had his own ways about him. Now, most of us don't know what that's like, to have our own ways about us. But Father Baden did. And the first thing that Bishop Flagey wanted to do was to consolidate the property of the Catholic Church in Kentucky for the purpose of building churches and so forth. But he ran into a buzzsaw because Baden would not hand them over. And so there were even lawsuits between them, and Baden usually won, because Baden said, and probably wisely so, we all know this from experience too, this was given to me for a particular purpose. If I simply hand it over to the bishop, how can I be sure that it will be used for the purpose for which it was given? And they never could resolve that for many, many years, until Baden later on even returned to France over the conflict for several years before returning and dying in Cincinnati in 1850. At any rate, what began then, and this, I mean, this is a great story, but all of this is more than just a story. One of the great things that we can now begin to see is this, and I ask you to watch this. Here we have a church being born on the frontier of America. It is connecting with those who had carried the faith even loosely with them over the mountains and so forth. What would you do? How would you go about establishing this community as a permanent part of the American story and of the Catholic Church? What would you do? How would you go about doing it? It's not really rocket science, because we've seen it happen over and over and over again in the story of the Church's interaction with Western society. The first thing that they began to do, and Father David did this, the first thing Father David did was open a seminary. As a Sulpician, this was natural to him. But the problem was they couldn't constantly be importing clergy from France all the time. They had to begin the establishment of an indigenous clergy. The first man to enter the seminary was a man by the name of a man by the name of Guy Chabrat, also a Frenchman. The seminary was called St. Thomas because Thomas Howard, one of the Catholics, had given the land in order for the seminary to be built. Father David then began and kept at work at this seminary for the rest of his life, eventually producing 30 priests for the frontier. But then he did something else, and he, along with Father Charles Nerings, did something else. What he did was he began to say, we have to not just train seminarians, we have to teach the children. How are we going to do that? How can we establish a strong Catholic community if we are not aware of the faith, if we do not understand the faith? How do you conduct a school on the frontier? What do you need? You need people who are willing to give of their lives for it, and who will do so not on a contractual basis necessarily, but with a living, a livelihood. And so Father Nerings and Father David both co-founded religious communities of women. If you're familiar with the place called Nerings, Kentucky, or Nazareth, Kentucky, these are the roots of the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth and the Sisters of Loretto at the foot of the cross. Father in Nerings, Kentucky. Father Nerings founded the Sisters of Loretto at the foot of the cross. Father John David, along with Mother Catherine Spaulding, founded the Sisters of Charity at Nazareth, Kentucky. They had written back to Mother Seton asking for some kind of sense of a rule that the sisters might follow, and that became the way that the Sisters of Charity developed their common life. I don't know if you ever saw them when they were still in their habits, but instead of wearing a veil, they wore the Kentucky sunbonnet. That was very characteristic of them for well over 150 years. You might also realize the impact and the power of change and time when you think of the Sisters of Loretto at the foot of the cross, founded in the frontier of Kentucky for the education of children and so forth. I don't know if any of you would remember, does the name Jacqueline Grennan ring a bell at all to anyone? She was one of the very first high-profile sisters to leave in the 1960s. She was the president of Webster Grove College in St. Louis, and eventually became, after she left and married, the president of Hunter College in New York. She was a Sister of Loretto at the foot of the cross. So, what a journey from the sisters on the frontier up into the 1960s. What a journey that was. What an experience that has been for us. But in no way, shape, or form does the outcome invalidate the concept. How do we implant the Catholic Church in any frontier? And we are on the verge of many new frontiers, for good or for ill. What do we do? How do we respond? And I think that this story from Bardstown, it's to give a narrative of the Bardstown experience it's too big, but to move into the core of what it is that it gives to us. It is an understanding of the inner dynamic of Catholicism interacting with a difficult contemporary world. What did they do? They did whatever they had to do. The priests did whatever was necessary in order to supply basic instruction and sacraments to the people. So often, as we find, I remember several years ago, I was assigned down into Appalachia, into southeastern Ohio, and I had 5 parishes. And traveling around and so forth, and I was criticized for that, many saying, well, you're just turning priests into a sacramental machine. There is no such thing as a sacrament administered without pastoral care. It doesn't exist. Are we to say that Father Baden was just a sacramental machine? I don't think so. Father Baden established the Catholic community in a vast territory, And he did so through administration of the sacraments, which people saw and understood as pastoral care. The other thing that happened, that was we have to educate the young, not in the wonders of modern secular society, but in the foundations of the deeply rooted manifestation of God's interchange with his people in the midst of time and place. That is not done through pure professionalism. That is done through sacrifice. And that it is, as a matter of fact, without the sacrifice, without taking on the hardships of the mission, it will not happen. We might produce somewhat ethically sensitive young people in a professional system, but without the cross, we will not communicate the faith. And the cross is that which is assumed by those who undertake the mission. The second thing that we understand is that there must be a fount of those young men willing to take up the cross of somehow being the ones who carry the pastoral sacramental care of the church to all the people who are in need. It is therefore a lesson, not just from Bardstown, not just from the frontier, but it is a lesson in every age of the church that without the cross, there is no revival. That without the cross, there is no regeneration. We don't have to be ideological Catholics. We have to be Catholics who are willing to sacrifice for the sake of the mission. That's what it's all about. And when we hear much of the complaining and all of that kind of thing about the physical care, about the burdens of celibacy, about any of those kinds of things, we just brush them aside. They have nothing to do with the issue. Whatever it might be, the issue is, what am I willing to give for the sake of the mission of the church in the world? That's the question priests and sisters have to ask. That's the question lay people have to ask. What did Bishop Carroll encounter? Yeah, we want what you got, but we're not going to help you give it. You can't do that. People can't do that. On the other hand, those who say, well, I'm not going to do it if I can't have everything I want, that doesn't work either. What we learn from Kentucky, in this country, on this frontier, is that it was sacrifice of people giving their lives that firmly rooted and established the Catholic presence in the development of frontier America. From Kentucky to Cincinnati, from Cincinnati to Detroit, and so forth, this flower blossomed and bloomed. When Bishop Flagey, who was bishop for over 40 years, he died in 1850, having spent almost all of that time, even in his late 70s, on horseback. And when Louisville was made an archdiocese eventually, it included the suffragan sees, or when Cincinnati was made an archdiocese, it included the suffragan sees of Detroit, Cleveland, Vincennes, and Louisville. Flagey went from Montreal to Buffalo to Chicago to St. Louis to Nashville, all of them on pastoral journeys covering the territories which had been given to him as the Bishop of Bardstown. When we look at this, and we look at even these struggles, these battles that they had, they were human. Even with the tragic end of the reign of Archbishop Purcell of Cincinnati and a financial collapse and crisis, all of these things, it didn't matter how they turned out, it mattered how they did what they did. And when they gave everything that they had to the mission of the church in all of its diversity and all of its many avenues, they were alive and they were effective. And these large religious communities of women, the SCNs and the Sisters of Loretto and so forth, brought eventually the Dominican sisters came in 1820 also into Kentucky, the very ones who eventually created colleges, high schools, and so forth across the country. And eventually also the Ursulines arrived, the Mercies arrived. Purcell brought in the Precious Blood Fathers, the Precious Blood Sisters, the Franciscans from Tyrol, and so forth. All of these things helped to build up and to create a vital and living Catholic community. This afternoon, as we reflect on this story, perhaps one thing we might do is pray. Pray for the church. Pray for a spirit of wisdom and of sacrifice. Not that we come up with a better 5-year plan. They didn't work in the Soviet Union either. Not that we come up with any of those kinds of things. Let us pray that the Catholic people, with the clergy and the religious, together assume the obligation of the cross and realize that as modernity unfolds, that cross may well become heavier and heavier, and yet think back to the man who alone for 14 years lived in the saddle in order to get the sacraments. Think of the women who gathered in drafty log huts, spending their days trying to teach and gather the young. Think of Bishop Flagey on horseback from Buffalo to Chicago, visiting the Catholic communities of his diocese. Think of those things, and then not say, well, gee, you know, that was so long ago, they were used to that. No, they weren't. And we are not used to what we will face either. But let us together resolve that with the cross of Christ, we will face it all to the greater honor and glory of God, and to the goodness and the wonder and the help and the salvation of our world.